Okay, this is the second of the tectonic geomorphology lectures. The first one was on faulting and active faulting, how to recognize faults in the landscape. This lecture is going to focus on folding, a different type of crustal deformation. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple different dating methods that we can use to date young geomorphic features. So there's a lot to say about folding, and I don't know how many people have had structural geology already, but I'm going to give a very quick little review. Um, and folding is a slightly more ductile type of deformation of the Earth's crust. So the crust is not just breaking along faults, it's actually folding, it's sort of bending in different areas. For the purpose of this lecture, I'm going to characterize folds into two different categories. You have what we call regular folds, which is also called buckling, and that's where you have shortening of the Earth's crust and some layers within the stratigraphy are being shortened and are folded as a result. No faults need to be involved in this. And then we also have what we consider folds that are directly related to some underlying fault, and that's typically what active folding. Um, and what I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on today because this is somewhat common in Southern California. Um, Most active folds, and when I say active, I mean that they're moving now or they've moved in the last 10,000 years in the Holocene. So we're not talking about folds that formed, millions of years ago. But most active folds tend to have some sort of surface expression. In other words, you see a fold in the landscape that sort of reflects the shape. So you have a ridge showing the location of an active fold. So just to review real quick the basics of folding, we tend to categorize them as either anticlines, where the two limbs of the fold are dipping away from the center of the fold, from the axis. So your limbs are here and here. This is where you have stratigraphy that's sort of inclined downward away from the axis, and we would call that an anticline. The syncline is shown in the middle here, where the limbs are dipping towards the axis. And then over on the right, we have another anticline. Skipping down to the parts of the fold, we have the hinge or the fold axis as being sort of the point of maximum curvature, and the limbs are the more straighter sections on either side. Also shown here are the axial planes. So a fold axis is just an orientation of a line in space, and it could be anywhere. I mean, it can be located at the surface, it can be down here between these two layers. I mean, it's literally just anywhere. But the fold, the axial surface is the surface that connects all these hinge lines. Okay. Now, why is that important? Because if we're trying to describe the shape of the fold, like if the whole thing is tilted over a little bit, um, you would need to describe the fold axial surface in order to show that the fold is tilted a little bit. So folds can also be plunging, which means that their axis is going down in one direction. I'll show you that on the next slide. They can be recumbent, which is where the fold axis, the axial surface is bent over, so the whole fold is bent like this. They can be symmetric, as shown in this diagram. They can be asymmetric, so there's all different types of folds. We're not going to worry too much about these different types, but we'll see in some of the pictures that not all folds are perfectly upright as we see in this picture. So here's an example of a plunging fold. This is where the hinge is going down in one direction. So this is what it would look like before erosion, and after erosion you might have, if you have a difference in erodibility of the layers, you might have a more resistant layer kind of making this horseshoe shape where it's sticking up and the weaker layers have been eroded out. So that's what we mean by a plunging fold. It's tilting in one direction. And we'll see in a second that this is kind of characteristic of active folds that are propagating in one direction or another. They have this this plunge appearance to them. So fault-related folds are any folds that are occurring in association with active faults or above active faults. So typically what we see, especially in Southern California, is we get oftentimes folding above what we call blind faults. A blind fault is a fault that does not reach the surface. And we call it blind because if you're standing up on top of the surface and trying to map active faults, you wouldn't even know that this is down here because you don't see it intersecting the surface. However, it's very common for the layering to be folded above these blind faults. And so this gives us an indication that there are active faults down deeper. Here's just another simplistic diagram showing that you would have fault offset at depth, and this is a reverse fault that I've shown with the hanging wall on the left going up, footwall on the right going down. And you see that above that fault, there's folding of the layers, and because it's active, it's actually folding the surface. As time progresses and you have repeated earthquakes on this fault, it typically grows a little bit more and more, and eventually it breaks to the surface. But it takes some time until that occurs. And so we have multiple blind folds. I'm sorry, this text should say blind faults, but we have multiple folds that are overlying blind faults in the LA area. So here are a couple of examples in the East LA area, kind of Montebello Hills. This is a fold axis with the blind Whittier fault underneath. In the sort of Fullerton, Brea area, these are called the Coyote Hills. Same thing, there's a blind fault underneath, creating a fold above. The San Joaquin Hills down in southern Newport and Laguna Beach, down all the way to Dana Point, same thing. You have a blind fault down there that's creating these folds. So I'm going to quickly show you some cross sections across this right here, this Coyote Hills. The fault underneath is dipping to the north. So this cross section, B is on the south and B4 is on the north. So underneath there's a fault that dips to the north. It does not break the surface. And here you see it, this is a seismic cross section, and someone has mapped in the layers. This is based on well control. The vertical blue lines are wells. So, you wouldn't be able to recognize this very easily just from the data shown here, but they've mapped in these horizons and we see that they're folded up here, but broken down at depth. Okay, so this fold is expressed in the shallow stratigraphy. Now, at the surface, where this cross-section is taken is across the 605 freeway area. There is no surface expression of the fold either, so the topography, you don't even see it. But farther to the east, in this area, kind of Fullerton area, you can actually see it. So this fault and fold is possibly growing towards the west over time. And over time, these hills will continually pop up and migrate towards the west as this fault evolves through time. Okay. Just quickly, the area that I mentioned in East LA is what's called the Elysian Park Anticlinorium. It's a big fold structure. As I said, this is probably the result of the Whittier fault down at depth, which created a magnitude 5.9 earthquake in 1987. In this area, the Whittier fault is called the Montebello thrust. As you go towards the southeast, it becomes the Whittier fault, and it's actually expressed at the surface. You can sort of see these deflected streams going through from kind of Whittier area down through north part of Brea into Yorba Linda and across the 91 freeway. Okay, so just a couple of examples of some blind faults with folding above them in the LA area. So those faults that I showed you are mainly, those are fault propagation folds. So these are folds that are occurring in the hanging wall of a thrust or reverse fault that's coming off of a deeper kind of flat detachment fault at the surface. It comes along, it starts to ramp up through the stratigraphy, and as it does that, you get these folds forming in the hanging wall above that fault. You can also get what we call fault bend folds. These are usually from what we call a ramp in the detachment fault at depth, where the fault is flat, it starts to ramp up through the topography a little bit and then flattens out again, and you get a fold forming above that. So at the surface, you see these folds, and you can infer based on some criteria I'll show you the next slide that these are active folds and that there's a fault down beneath, but you wouldn't really know the specific geometry of the fault at depth without getting subsurface data of some sort. Okay. Hold on a second. Butters needs to leave the room. Goodbye, Butters. So other types of fault-related folds, these can be found not only in reverse and thrust faults, shortening tectonics, but also in normal faults occasionally. So the picture that I show here is showing a normal fault that shallows out at depth. And what they're showing is that, if there was no folding, you would create this big gap, this big hole in the earth that would extend down at depth. Well, isostasy, the kind of gravitational potential across the surface of the earth wouldn't allow that to happen. This would collapse, and it does. And so instead, what you get is an anticline, a little fold that they call a rollover anticline associated with normal faults. Strike slip folds can also occur, folding along big strike slip faults. We tend to call those transpressional folds, where you are sliding two blocks across past each other, but at the same time there's some vertical motion. So you have some strike slip plus some either normal or reverse slip, and you get what we call transpressional folds. Okay. But I want to talk about what we call propagating folds. So these are active folds that are growing in one or two directions. So they're sort of laterally growing across the landscape. And again, this is usually due to a fault growing underneath the fold. However, it can also occur without a fault whatsoever, just progressive shortening of the crust creating this actively growing fold. So there's a couple geomorphic criteria, and by that we mean things that you can look for in the landscape that would suggest that you have an actively propagating fold. And these can be used to determine the direction that fold is growing, the rate, and possibly even the history. So the first of these criteria is what we call the elevation of wind or water gaps. So if you have streams that are crossing an area and then you start to grow a fold underneath there, just like we were dealing with the Newport Inglewood fault lab and the field trip, we were talking about this folds that were sort of growing along the fault, but we have these big rivers, the LA River, San Gabriel River, Santa Ana River, cutting across. Well, those rivers are able to cut down through the fold, right? Now imagine if that fold is growing laterally and there's multiple rivers. If the fold grows enough, it might actually defeat that river, and that river can no longer continue across it. Instead, it has to divert around it. And when that happens, the old stream channel, that old canyon that stream or river formed, becomes dry, and it just lifts up and it becomes a low spot in the topography. And so now, instead of water flowing through there, it's just empty, and they call that a wind gap. Another thing can be just the elevation of the top of the fold. If you see that decreasing down in one direction, you can infer that the fold is growing in one direction or the other. So I'm going to come back to that slide in a second, but I want to show you these first two. Elevation of wind or water gaps. So here what I'm trying to draw is a cross-section of a fold. So you're looking perpendicular to the fold axis. So the fold, which I've drawn the axis sort of in this dashed blue line, and it's an anticline, so I tried to show that it's dipping, away from the axis on each side. Imagine that we're looking straight down the path of, let's say, the San Gabriel River, or a river that was flowing across this area. So it used to flow here, but as the fold grew, it finally got tall enough, or it grew fast enough that the river didn't have enough power to keep cutting through. So instead, it diverted to a new spot. And then eventually it couldn't pass through there anymore either, and it diverted to another spot. And so the blue here is representing that this is where the river is actually still flowing. The places where it got defeated, we would call wind gaps. So by looking at the elevation of these through time, you can see, the river used to flow here, but it got lifted up too high, then it was here, and now it's here, and eventually it'll probably jump to here, out where these houses are. So this whole area is rising through time, and it's propagating out towards the right. So two things, the kind of increasing elevation of these wind gaps shows that this thing is growing, as well as the elevation of just the crest of the fold, the top of the fold. Okay. Other things that we can look at is the degree of dissection of drainages. And so we talked about that actually in the GIS lab, that initially you get really high density of drainage development, and it will kind of these small drainages will coalesce into bigger ones over time. If you see progressively younger deposits or terraces, geomorphic surfaces in one direction, it's kind of telling you that the topography is growing in one direction or the other. Or progressive dip changes, rotation or inclination of the edges of the fold over time. Okay. So I want to show you a couple examples. What we're looking at here is a map of the Western Transverse Ranges. So what I've drawn in red are the major faults of this area, and in green are the mountain ranges, the higher elevations, and then the white area are showing the low elevation valleys. So LA is down here, Palos Verdes right there, here's the Santa Monica Mountains. Up towards Santa Barbara, you have the Santa Ynez Range, and you have a whole bunch of mountain ranges back in here. Okay, and all the red lines are the faults. So at the north end of the transverse ranges, kind of the southern end of the Great Valley, we have a place that's called Wheeler Ridge, and this is what it looks like in the Google topo map. So it's a big ridge, and out towards the west, you see it gets lower and lower and lower. And so this is an example of a propagating fold, an active anticline, and it's propagating towards the right, towards the east, towards In-N-Out Burger, at about 30 millimeters per year. And so there's some drainages in here where this river used to pass through, and then it got defeated to another spot, and now it's passing through here, and it will eventually go through here. Okay, so the uplift at the youngest part of the fold is about 3 millimeters per year. Another example in the transverse ranges down here near the city of Camarillo. Here we see another kind of ridge that is, if we put the geology on it, it is a fold. So here's another anticline. It's plunging towards the west this time, towards the left. It's higher in the east, lower in the west. And so this fold is growing towards the west over time. So you can hopefully see in the topography the extensive drainage development that's occurred over here in the older part, and you see there's not quite the big canyons. Instead, there's a bunch of small little ones over here towards the western part. So this fold is growing the opposite direction of the Wheeler Ridge. This one is growing towards the west. All right. So that's enough for folds, active folds. I wanted to quickly give you some a little bit of background about ways that we can date geomorphology, and we call these quaternary dating methods. So methods that can date deposits over the Holocene and Pleistocene. A lot of dating methods in geology are dating really old things, Miocene, Mesozoic, older ages, when you're dealing with uranium lead dates or zircons or other things you might have heard of. But what about dating active tectonics? So I'm going to show you a few. Here's a very young deposit, and if we, this is a fluvial terrace. If we wanted to know how old this was, there's a couple different methods that we can use to date that. But first, I'm going to talk about relative dating. So without getting an actual number, the degree of weathering on a deposit can tell us something about the relative age of different deposits or rocks. So here we're looking at an example. I think I showed these pictures when we were in the weathering lecture in soils, but you can see that this is black basalt, but you can see it's kind of reddish. It's out in the desert, it's rusting. This car is also rusting just like the rocks. So based on the degree of weathering, you can tell the relative age of two different deposits. So this picture, which I've shown before, is a great example. If you look at the alluvial fan here, it's reddish, rusted, it's been weathered, it's been exposed to the atmosphere a greater amount of time. And here are the newer deposits. They're whiter and fresh looking. They have not been weathered as much. So we can tell that this is younger and this is older. We don't know the exact age in numbers, but we just know younger versus older, and sometimes that's valuable. Like for example, on the Newport Inglewood field trip, at the first stop, I was talking about those two different terraces at Bolsa Chica, and I was like, if I don't know the exact ages of these, how could I tell whether they are the same age or whether the higher one is actually older? The correct answer is to look at the soil development on each terrace. If they're the same age, the soil development or the weathering should look the same. But if the older one, if the higher one is older, then it should have a greater degree of weathering. So it should have a more well-developed soil horizon, thicker profiles, thicker soil layers and horizons within that. So I won't go through the basics of the soil horizons because we've already done that, but looking at soil development can give you an idea of relative age of a young geologic deposit in the landscape. How could relative dating be helpful other than just saying this is older and this is younger? So here's an example of that. This is a digital elevation model of the Lake Cachuma area up north of Santa Barbara. And there's a whole bunch of drainages here, and the colors are different river terraces. And there's 3 different levels of river terraces throughout this area. There's yellow, which is the youngest, lowest, closest to the active river. There's orange, which is a little bit higher, and there's red, which is even higher. So if I want to know the age of these terraces throughout the area, without having any numeric dates, I could map out the relative positions of these terraces in terms of how high they are from the active river and the amount of soil development on them. And so that's what these colors represent. That was the first thing that was done. We went out here, mapped them, and looked at the relative soil development. So we knew red was the oldest, orange was intermediate, yellow was the youngest. Then later we were able to get actual numeric dates on these terraces, and that's what these numbers are representing. So the oldest one is around 80,000 years, possibly as old as 81, as young as 67. The orange is 65,000 years, the yellow is 40,000 years. So now I've got dates from just one canyon, but since I've correlated these across an entire area based on the degree of soil development, I don't have to date this deposit over here. I know based on the soil development that it's the same age as this one here, which I got a numeric date of 80,000 years. So we actually have dates in other places as well, but the point is that I can date deposit in one canyon or one area, and if I've correlated the soil development across an entire large area, I now immediately know the age of those other ones based on the fact that it's weathered to the same degree as the terrace that I got a numeric date on. Okay. So 3 different types of dating that I wanted to mention here. First, carbon-14. I'm sure everyone's heard of this. Even non-geologists are familiar with radiocarbon dating. Um, this is the time span that you can date things is basically the year 1900 back to about 30,000 years ago. You can push it a little bit older, maybe to 50 at the max, but you're getting higher uncertainty. And the basic idea is that when something organic dies, uh, it starts to no longer produce a certain type of carbon. And instead, that carbon starts to decay to another type. Okay, so we're talking about carbon 14 to carbon 12. And so you're looking at the proportion of these two types of carbon um, in the material that you're dating, and knowing the half-life, knowing how long it takes for that decay to occur, which is 5,700 years, you can then infer the age of that material and therefore the age of the deposit that it's in. So here's a graduate student of mine collecting some detrital charcoal, like a piece of charcoal that would have gotten entrained into this deposit. The charcoal was probably produced from a forest fire and then got stuck in this sand as it was deposited. And we can use that to date and figure out how old this deposit is. So this can be used on bones, charcoal, peat. Sometimes if you have soil with a lot of organic matter, you can kind of take a big chunk of it and filter that organic matter out, dead plants or trees. But again, this only goes back to 30,000 years. And you have to be lucky enough to find one of these things, some kind of organic matter in the deposit. And that doesn't exist everywhere. In a lot of places, charcoal, bones, this stuff gets destroyed and it's not preserved. So another method, well, this was another slide about carbon-14. I'm going to skip this. It's just basically noting that there's some complications with how you determine the actual age of the radiocarbon. So I'm going to skip ahead to this slide. Another method that we can use is called optically stimulated luminescence. And what this is, and this goes back farther in time. So instead of 30,000 years, you can date things back to 300,000 years. So this is useful for looking at things that are slightly older. It's also useful because you don't have to have organic material. You can use anything with quartz or feldspar grains, which, those of you that have taken mineralogy or something, these are the two most common minerals found at the surface of the earth. So they're everywhere almost. So this really opens up the possibilities. You can date anything that is sort of sand silt. So it could be river terraces, wind-blown loess, beach sand or dunes. And what you're dating is the last time that these grains were exposed to light. I thought I had another slide on it, but these quartz and feldspar grains, as they're traveling through a river or getting blown by the wind or moving back and forth on the beach, they're exposed to sunlight. The minute they get buried and no longer exposed to sunlight, they start to collect radiation from the surrounding soil. So even just beach sand has a little bit of radioactive material in it, potassium, uranium, thorium, and it's giving off small amounts of radiation. Well, some of that gets trapped in the quartz and feldspar grains, and it gets stored there. And the longer it's buried, the more it collects, the more it stores. So then if you collect the sample in the dark, take it into a dark lab, and then give it a little bit of a little pulse of light just to sort of make it react, it will suddenly give off that stored radiation, and you can measure that. And if you know the amount and you know the rate at which it builds up, you then can determine the age of the deposit. So we call this OSL, optically stimulated luminescence. The third is what's called cosmogenic radionuclides. And what this is that when a deposit, a boulder, a piece of sand or whatever is exposed at the surface, it's also exposed to incoming radiation from outer space, from outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And that builds up over time. And so then you can take that deposit and you can measure the amount of material that has been created from the interaction of incoming radiation with the minerals in that material. And same thing, you know the rate at which it's produced, and if you know the amount, then you can expose or extrapolate and then figure out the age of it. So there's a couple different minerals that are used. Beryllium-10 is a common one. Aluminum-26 is another. And you can either do this in what they call exposure dating. So if I have something like the wall of a canyon in Yosemite and I want to know how long that's been exposed to the atmosphere, I can collect a sample and figure that out. Or I can do what we call burial dating, where you dig a hole in the deposit, a river terrace or marine terrace or something, and you collect a couple samples at different depths. And then you look at the concentrations of this radionuclides that are created by the interaction with cosmic radiation and figure out the age of it that way. Okay. So those three methods that I just talked about are currently the most commonly used methods for dating really young deposits and geomorphic processes at the surface of the Earth. So that's the end of this lecture, and I'll see you guys on